The world moves forward at an exponential pace. We are impartial arbiters of knowledge. We are the navigators of disruption. We link our known to your unknown. We anticipate what it will take to thrive. Protecting your potential for growth in an exponential world. We are the trusted advisor.
Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Sean Marcel with Cerestel, and welcome to this episode of The Grind. For the first time viewers, why do we call it The Grind? Simply because we're going to have a 30-minute chat over coffee with our guest today, and doing business is a grind. You know, staying profitable, staying ahead of the curve, and helping the planet as well. So when it comes to Cerestel, our motto is and capabilities are to lower the operating costs of organizations by 30 to 40% for their key expenditures, and I'll get into that in a second, while positively impacting the planet. So you don't have to have this either or scenario. You can accomplish both. So the three areas that we focus on are next-gen IT solutions, utility optimization, and sustainability solutions. And we're going to dive deep today into, even though it's called Carbon Offset Credits 101, it's probably going to be a pretty deep dive for most of us out there. So when it comes to that, you know, when you look at sustainability and you look at the cycle or the different components needed to have a good sustainability program, you're looking at measure, manage, offset, report, and optimize. And today, again, we're going to dive into the offset world of credits. So with me today, I have Christy Gamble. Christy, welcome to the call. Thank you so much for taking the time out today.
Oh, thank you, Sean. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. Why don't you introduce yourself and the company Cloverly, and then we'll let you jump into it. And as we go, we'll ask some questions and see what we can learn today on carbon offset credits.
Well, that sounds great. Thank you. So, hi, everyone. My name is Christy Gamble. I'm the Director of Business Development with Cloverly. Cloverly is a climate action platform that's helping to facilitate the purchase of high-quality carbon credits. Companies can use these credits to offset their emissions or contribute to climate action. And I'm coming to Cloverly after spending a decade working in concrete, of all things, leading a sustainability initiative to reduce the carbon footprint of concrete. And through that experience, I saw firsthand how impactful carbon credit investment was in actually accelerating decarbonization solutions in a really hard to abate industry. So I'm really excited now to be able to provide more insight into the carbon credit market and understanding how any organization can support carbon reduction innovation through carbon offsetting.
Excellent.
So what we're going to talk about today is, first of all, I'm going to set the stage to help understand what the role is of carbon offsetting in the bigger picture of ESG. This might be familiar territory for some, but for many, ESG is a pretty new topic, and we're all trying to figure out, what does this mean for business? I'll then get into a little bit more detail about carbon credits, understanding the different types of credits and how to assess quality and risk factors, and then just some of the practicalities about how to acquire and retire. And of course, before I go, I'll share a little bit about how Cloverly can help with all of the above. So starting with the need for climate action. First of all, what is ESG? Well, we've heard this term a lot, I'm sure. It's environmental social governance, and it's a standard set of it's a set of standards that a company can use to really look at the really look at, what practices are being used by a business. Investors can look at to understand, what are the impacts of this business beyond the financial type of reporting mechanisms. So in the scope of ESG, there's actually quite a few different components around the social and the governance piece. But where we tend to focus most of our conversation is on the environmental component, and particularly within that, the carbon emissions. What are the carbon emissions of an organization, and what is being done to manage and reduce those emissions?
So Christy, just to echo what you're talking about on that slide, when it comes to ESG, Searstel, for the viewers out there, we're not ESG consultants. However, we have solutions for the different components of the journey when somebody is going through a sustainability or initiating an ESG program. And we do have ESG consultants in our portfolio to complement and supplement what we're talking about today, where Cloverly can help you get to that net zero emission standard that often people are striving to today. And like you said, it's new, right? It's really exciting on what's going on around this world. So I just wanted to just kind of echo that we're focused also on the E in ESG, and that's our primary role. And we'll bring in a consultant if need be to help the clients vet out what they need to put in place and one day get to the offsets.
That's fantastic. And, just to speak to this slide here on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, ultimately, why do we focus on carbon emissions? Well, it's because carbon emissions are one of the most impactful substances on the planet today. Of course, there are other environmental initiatives such as reducing waste and pollution that are extremely important. But ultimately, the science is pretty clear that greenhouse gases, and particularly CO2, are having an impact on the climate, and this needs to be mitigated very soon in order to mitigate the effects of climate change. So from this, how do we calculate CO2 emissions? This is, not a very easy substance to actually account for because it's not tangible. You can't see it. And yet at the same time, we can actually measure the specific amount of CO2 or other greenhouse gases that are being emitted by organizations. So the standard way of measuring is dictated by the GHG, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And there are 3 different scopes of emissions. So scope 1 are the direct emissions that a company will emit through either the buildings or vehicles that it owns and operates. Scope 2 are the indirect emissions that are coming from the building that are being used, but the emissions themselves are not coming out of that building. They're being purchased, it's coming from purchased electricity, heating and cooling systems where the emissions are being actually emitted off-site. So these emissions are pretty easy to calculate. Most companies who have gotten involved in ESG will start with scope 1 and 2, and that's relatively easy to understand. The next area is scope 3. These are the indirect emissions that occur from your upstream and downstream supply chain. This is a lot harder to measure and to manage because it's not a direct control of the company itself. But this is an area of focus where there's increasing scrutiny, is understanding supply chain emissions and just finding ways to reduce them.
So just talking a little bit about the different scopes and the impact. So before somebody can understand how much they need to buy or how many metric tons of offset credits they need, they definitely have to be able to understand what they're generating, right? And there's the 3 buckets that you mentioned. So one thing that we love about the partnership with Cloverly is we have partners that also do the carbon and utility accounting so that you can, as a client, understand all these different things that are going on. We see that most, to your point, are focused on scope 1 and scope 2. But we have seen clients even calculating the carbon footprint around the toilet paper consumed in the building, all the way down to that level in scope 3, because they were very advanced in their requirements. But when it comes to the offset credits themselves, being 1 metric ton of carbon. Is it equivalent? Does it apply the same to a scope 1 emission as a scope 2 or scope 3 when it comes to, saying 0, 1 minus 1 is 0 as an example?
In the most simplistic way, yes. Ultimately, we're looking at what is the metric tons of CO2 that are emitted from scope 1, 2, and 3. And let's find ways to offset that through a metric ton of CO2 that is avoided or removed. Now, it can get more nuanced. There are different types of credits that can be more applicable for different types of scopes if we really want to get very granular about it. Many types of topics around the ESG, carbon accounting and carbon offsetting world can become very granular the more that we start to dive into it. But I will just say, generally speaking, the simplistic answer is yes, there's a metric ton of CO2 that was emitted through your business practices. Let's find another way to mitigate that.
Great. And not to steal your thunder, because we'll wait for the upcoming slides that you have on the different types. So thank you for clarifying.
Fantastic. And, this is a really good segue into the next topic of why do we measure in the first place? Well, I think we've all heard that old adage of you can't manage what you can't measure. So the measurement component is really important because it helps you to understand where those carbon emissions are coming from. How are you going to reduce them if you don't know where the low-hanging fruit is in terms of here's where we're emitting a lot of CO2. So this is where we better start to figure out how we're going to reduce that. So the path to net zero ultimately involves measuring, managing, finding alternative energy sources or low carbon products for your supply chain, and then offsetting the emissions that can't be managed in that year in order to both reduce that impact and create more of a financial incentive for the organization to continue to mitigate and reduce those emissions. You want to report those emissions just as you would report, your financial, your balance sheets. You want to report what your carbon footprint looks like, what's being done to reduce it. And it's important to disclose in any kind of sustainability reporting what role offsetting has played in achieving climate objectives, and continue to do this process annually. This is not something that any company will perfect in the course of a year. It will likely take decades, but over the course of decades, this can become more and more refined. The data can become better. The importance is just starting now and doing the cycle and improving as we continue to go.
Something on the reporting that I've noticed is, for example, with Yahoo Finance, there's actually a section now on publicly traded companies for sustainability and ESG that they're getting rated and scored as well that way. So it's definitely something that we're continuing to see gain traction in the marketplace, and the need to be able to effectively report is critical to achieve the organization's mission and vision. So
absolutely,
we're definitely seeing the emphasis on this on an annual basis, and it's tough. It's tough to do by spreadsheets. So we love helping people get there so they can purchase a credit.
And Sean, we're not necessarily getting into the why engage in ESG reporting or offsetting or any of that, but very simplistically, it's becoming a really important differentiator from a brand perspective for consumers and increasingly for employee retention.
Absolutely.
So getting into then the carbon offsetting component, that's what we're here to talk about. Carbon offsetting is when an organization purchases a carbon credit that compensates a project for removing or avoiding the emission of greenhouse gases in order to negate that organization's own emissions. So simply put, if you've calculated your organization's carbon footprint and determined that it's 1 metric ton of CO2 that has been emitted, it's probably a lot more. But if it's 1 metric ton, let's find a metric ton of CO2 savings that can occur outside of your own business that can compensate for that CO2 that you have emitted. So you're basically saying we've done what we can to reduce our emissions, or maybe you're just starting and you've simply calculated what those emissions are. this is a way to be able to send finances to a project to support that project to actually reduce or remove a metric ton of CO2 on your behalf. So now, introduction into the carbon credits. Quick clarification on, what is a carbon credit versus a carbon offset. A carbon credit is an instrument. It is defined as a metric ton of CO2. So it is an asset that can be traded, sold, or retired. It's issued by third-party registries. There is a reporting verification process attached to it. And it can be purchased by companies who are looking to achieve sustainability goals. So that can include an offset of their emissions, but doesn't have to. As much as we often talk about offsetting in terms of, I've emitted a ton of CO2, I'm therefore going to purchase 1 metric ton of carbon credits. It doesn't have to be a one-to-one relation. Companies often will choose to make climate contributions in order to just do something good and be able to create a positive narrative. So carbon credits, however, are not built equally. Their integrity, the quality really differs from credit to credit. And this is probably one of the most important principles that we're going to dive into, is that while all carbon credits are defined as a metric ton of CO2 that's avoided or removed, not all carbon credits are created equally.
Yeah, and the price varies greatly from one to the next. And Christy's got some great examples coming up on those differences, because it really blew my mind when we first started talking and working with you all, how complex it really is to do everything and validate the credit source and making sure it's viable. And you guys do an excellent job of that. So I just mentioned that because it's so fascinating to me. Anyway, I'll let you continue.
It's really not as simple as you might think it should be. And so what I'll do is describe a little bit of detail about what the different types of carbon credits are and how to generate them. And it'll start to provide some insight into, how complex it is to be able to really measure what is the quality of a carbon credit. So first of all, there are 2 main types of carbon credits. There are avoidance credits and removal credits. Avoidance credit is a credit that can quantify and show the avoidance of CO2 being emitted. So this is where a company is paying another company, organization, project to avoid the emission of CO2 through some sort of innovative mechanism. Removal credits is where CO2 is actually removed from the atmosphere. So a very common example of that I'll get into is through tree planting type of initiatives, where those trees are actually able to remove CO2 from the atmosphere.
Interesting.
And how these carbon credits are generated can come from a number of different ways. There are probably about 20 commonly known carbon credit mechanisms that exist today, but there are far more than that are emerging and possible. So just giving some examples that I'll dive into, there are concepts such as, planting trees or avoiding the deforestation of forest land, but there are also engineered solutions and different types of really innovative solutions that are emerging. So an example of that at its purest form of carbon removal is direct air capture. So direct air capture is an engineered solution. You can see it kind of looks like giant air conditioning units that are being placed in fields. And these units are actually sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, processing and then the CO2, and then creating permanent storage solutions to get rid of the CO2. So this is an example of a really effective method of being able to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. It just also happens to be very expensive. So the pros and cons of looking at how to reduce CO2 emissions.
So when it comes to that example, it's probably more, there's less risk, I guess, of the carbon credit existing and being proven that it was removed that there's no impeding factors that down the road over time that credit could be no longer it being applied or used.
Right. It's extremely quantifiable. You can measure exactly how many tons, how many kilograms, how many grams of CO2 have been removed through this mechanism. And then it's also very permanent because it's a through the direct air capture. The next stage is then the permanent removal of that CO2 through different types of storage mechanisms.
And you're right, it does look like air conditioning units at a co-location facility, like those big chillers and systems. So,
well, considering it's
interesting.
against global warming, it kind of is like a giant air conditioning unit for the planet.
Yeah, there you go.
So then, another side of it, this is the most common type of credit that exists. This is also a credit, though, where it's a very important credit to support, but there's also a lot of quality discrepancy. And this is in avoided deforestation. So avoided deforestation is where a carbon credit buyer is purchasing the protection of forest land to ensure that it does not get deforested by logging activities. A lot of these credits exist in places like the Amazon or Indonesia, all sorts of different locations where we have really important ecosystems. So the benefit of this is that, of course, you're protecting nature. Some of the really good credits are also supplying financial programs for Indigenous communities who are protecting these areas. But the hard part about these credits is then measuring, what is the actual carbon impact? And would this area of forest have been deforested if this carbon credit had not been sold? How are we ensuring that the forest is protected through the sale of this carbon credit? How do we know there's no leakage? Leakage is where, CO2 might be saved in this particular instance, but then actually ends up occurring somewhere else. So if we look at just this visual right here, how do we know that, okay, maybe we've purchased the credit to save the forest on the right side of this road, and the result of it is simply that the loggers then just move to the other side and take down those trees? Have you actually saved any CO2 from a net environmental perspective? So these are a lot of the questions that are asked when really looking at these avoided deforestation projects and other types of avoidance-based projects is, what is the baseline scenario, and how do I know that my carbon credit investment is actually making a tangible difference that we can measure and prove?
Something I just new for me is that you mentioned about it actually can help the Indigenous people in the area. So that's very cool that you can actually be contributing on a social way back to the locality, depending on the type of credit that you go after. So that could be something of importance with whatever industry that the client is in. So that's very cool.
Absolutely. And then I'll just give one example of a credit that actually does both of these. So this is Carbon Cure. This is the company that I spent a decade leading sustainability. And what Carbon Cure does is it takes CO2 that is captured from industrial sources, injects it into concrete where the CO2 becomes mineralized. So that is a permanent removal. We're taking CO2 that would otherwise be a greenhouse gas, injected into concrete where the CO2 converts into a stone, and it becomes permanently trapped in that concrete because it doesn't exist anymore. Concrete happens to be one of the few materials in the world that has the chemical ability to turn CO2 into a mineral, believe it or not.
Wow.
This process, though, also it improves the strength of concrete, and cement is the ingredient that gives concrete its strength. Cement is also a really carbon intensive ingredient. So the result of using CO2 is it allows the concrete producer to use less cement while still maintaining the strength of the concrete. And so what we're doing in this case is avoiding the CO2 that would otherwise have been emitted by that cement. So it's called a blended credit because it includes both removal and avoidance. And it's another example of, a fantastic innovative solution. And what I saw working at Carbon Cure firsthand was that the investment that came from carbon credits, from selling the CO2 that we were able to quantify as a removal and reduction, allowed this innovation to become financially accessible to more concrete producers and therefore accelerated adoption. And so this is where I became a very strong believer in the voluntary carbon market as a driver of sustainability and innovation. It's taking finances from the companies who are climate oriented and mission driven and putting that investment where it needs to go in these hard to abate industries.
That's impressive that it actually strengthens the concrete and lowers the amount of cement that needs to go into it, which avoids carbon production. So that's a very cool concept.
It's a fun company to be part of for sure. So all that said, I highlighted 3 credits. There are over 17,000 carbon credits across the globe, representing many different types of mechanisms coming from various communities all over. And so now, assessing the quality of these credits is challenging. And how do you evaluate quality? There are so many different factors to look at. Cloverly actually has 62 different evaluation points that we're applying. But there are some pretty key principles. One is the permanence. How long is that CO2 removed? So if we look at forests, for example, trees do have a lifespan. It's considered a short-term form of carbon removal because of the fact that those trees will die. They will not, continue to sequester CO2 into infinity. Versus mineralizing CO2 in concrete is a permanent solution. So therefore, there's more value attached to that. Looking at avoidance removal, the additionality. Additionality is that question of what impact is that money making in terms of actually saving CO2? Would this carbon savings have occurred had I not made this investment? And then the rest of it has a lot to do with the reporting verification that's attached to credits. It's just at the end of the day, how can we prove and quantify the CO2 savings that occurred here? So all of these different factors will impact the price. And if we look at, just a couple of examples here, you could see a credit that's $13 a ton. You can find credits in the marketplace as cheap as $1. Those ones are not good quality, but they do exist. So we see $10 a ton up to $900 a ton. So that's a really big difference. And the biggest factor that drives that is the actual cost of implementing the project itself. I mentioned those direct air capture units are just really expensive pieces of technology. That's why the credit is so expensive. But it's a very permanent removal solution. And so therefore, there's high value attached to it. The other thing that you mentioned, Sean, too, around social co-benefits. This is something that, I get really excited about, is that there are a lot of benefits to many of these carbon credits above and beyond simply the CO2 savings that can be quantified. Credits will, certain types of credits will protect wildlife, provide funding for Indigenous communities. There are many credits that are providing a funding source for women and supporting gender equality in different parts of the world. And so there's a lot of really good feel good type of side benefits to investing in these credits. And that can contribute, of course, to the price of the credit at the end of the day, just because of supply and demand factors.
Now, when it comes to, these 3 examples on there, and you're right, there's a big range. So there's one to fit all different shapes and sizes of budget or mission statement of a client. But is a metric ton, when purchased in, say, a carbon capture that has, a long lifespan, basically eternity, does it count every year? Does it count only in the 1 year that you can purchase it? How does that change, or does it change from one type of credit to the other?
Well, when credits are retired, and I'll get into that in a minute, it's a one-time instance. So this is where it does start to get a little complicated and nuanced, is that while, some credits, while each credit is counted as a metric ton, there is higher value attached to that metric ton of CO2 that has been removed permanently versus, a short-term removal mechanism. Yet at the same time, that metric ton is still 1 metric ton and can only be used once against that metric ton that you have calculated as part of your footprint for 2022, for example.
Oh, so it can only be used
Can only be used
for
once.
the one time. Okay, thank you for
From
clarifying. I wasn't
2026.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was permanent, if it had different impact on,
Right.
how many you have to rebuy and things of that nature.
Yeah. So this gets us into then the concept of acquiring and retiring. One of the really important elements of the whole carbon credit market is the fact that once a metric ton of CO2 has been quantified as avoided or removed, it can only be purchased and claimed once. Multiple companies cannot purchase the same credit. A company cannot purchase a credit once and continue to use it year after year to claim carbon neutrality. It's just simply not how the carbon accounting works. So first of all, a company needs to acquire a carbon credit. So once a company, let's just say, you as your organization has calculated your carbon footprint and made the decision to offset that footprint. Now you're trying to figure out, well, how do I offset it? What are the best, credits to buy? What budget should I put towards it? There are different ways to determine that. Right now, the carbon credit market is pretty nascent. It's brand new. It's kind of the Wild West. It's unregulated. So some companies, like Amazon, Microsoft, the big leaders in this space, have in-house carbon expertise where they are assessing and monitoring the various credits that are out there and making their own decisions based off of that climate science. Most organizations don't have that in-house expertise. So this is one of the services that Cloverly provides, is being able to provide that climate science in order to assess the various credits. But there are also different kinds of brokers that are out there, different types of organizations. The whole market and industry is really evolving every single day. And so there are many different ways that are emerging to be able to purchase these credits. But then once you've purchased a credit, you need to retire the credit. So credits are retired on a registry. When a carbon credit project is being developed, it goes through a registry. So these are third-party organizations. Common names are Verra, Gold Standard, Puro. And these are basically bodies that are saying, okay, we are going to give you the methodology, the scientific template to quantify your CO2 emissions. And then we will act as that data management to ensure that once you have declared a ton of CO2 as saved or moved or avoided, you now have to register that and retire it, meaning you can never sell that metric ton of CO2 again. And so this ensures that the whole system is traceable, measurable, and there's no double counting, there's no double selling. Now, not all credits are actually working through these registries. There is double counting, double selling of credits that happens across the globe today. That's why it's really important to work with trusted providers who are able to go through the retirement process and verify and ensure that when a company purchases a carbon credit for the sake of saying, I've offset my emissions, they know that that carbon credit is not being used by anyone else to also make that claim.
And that goes to speak to your project management of identifying which projects to create these different purchase capabilities, right? For the different programs that you guys are vetting them, you guys are making sure they're part of the registry and stuff like that before it's offered out to the public.
Exactly. Any type of credit that is available on Cloverly's marketplace or that we support the purchase of have these mechanisms in place. We would not support the purchase of credits that don't have this ability to retire the credits appropriately.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something buyer beware for sure, because it like you mentioned the Wild West kind of thing analogy, and it's so new, right? So it's really, really important that when you're spending these types of dollars to know that that they're real and that they truly are ethical and working in the right direction to go alongside your sustainability program. So
Yeah,
very
absolutely.
interesting.
Then the next part is, how do you discuss your carbon credit purchase? ESG programs, the primary benefit of these ESG programs is really attached to brand value. This it provides a competitive advantage for sales, for employee retention and attraction. So it is really important to be able to message what good has been done. But there are some cautions in that it's very important to message these purchases accurately and appropriately. We have seen instances, you see it across the news, of companies that will make claims of carbon neutrality or net zero based off of the purchase of certain kinds of carbon credits that, there's really flaws within the analysis that led to that conclusion. So it's important to understand what types of claims can be made for the purchase of credits and offsetting. And most importantly, at the end of the day, transparency will always win. It's a really, really good thing for organizations to purchase carbon credits, support climate action, offset their own emissions. But it's equally important to make sure that there's transparency by that organization to say, we emitted 10,000 tons of CO2. We purchased 10,000 tons of carbon credits in order to offset our emissions as a signal of our climate action. But we are committed to reducing that 10,000 tons that we emitted this past year. Next year, we're going to have 9,000 tons. And by the time we get to 2030, we're going to have zero. And we will continue to be carbon neutral by offsetting our emissions, but we will rely on those carbon credits less and less over time. Or we'll continue to support climate action, but we're still going to make sure that we are doing what we need to do in order to reduce our own operation and our supply chain emissions.
Yeah, I definitely think it's something that there's continuous improvement that goes on year after year after year as technologies change. So could then the amount of credits that you need to consume and purchase, right? If you're updating your LED lighting and you're getting more efficiency out of it, you're lowering your electricity. All of those things, going back to your graphic of the managing and reporting, are so critical to a successful sustainability program.
You're absolutely right. So that's kind of the meat of Carbon Credits 101. There's so much more we can talk about there. But where can Cloverly help companies who are engaging in this and interested? Well, Cloverly is a carbon credit marketplace that vets high quality, high integrity carbon credits. So any credit that is purchased through Cloverly's marketplace, you can have confidence and trust that we have vetted out and mitigated the risks as much as possible in order to ensure that you are delivering that climate action that is intended by the credit. And how we do that is through two mechanisms. We have an API technology that allows companies to build products that enable carbon offsetting. So an example of that is an activity, a transaction. So example, you take a flight, you can select the ability to offset my flight, the carbon footprint of that flight, for example. The other way that we work with companies is developing portfolios to purchase carbon credits. So I'm a big believer in the concept of a portfolio approach. If you're going to, let's say, purchase 10,000 tons of credits, if you're going to invest in the stock market, you're not necessarily going to invest all in one one stock. There's risk involved in that mechanism. You can also expand your impact by selecting more credits. So what we really like to do is encourage a portfolio approach to carbon offsetting, where you're supporting different types of projects. It does reduce exposure and risk attached to it in the rare event that one of these projects fail. An example of that could be a forest fire, wiping out the avoided deforestation project that you financed. But it also allows you to just bring in more narratives that can really help to advance your brand. I really like to ask companies, who is the intended audience here and what do they care about? What do your clients care about? What do your employees care about? Is gender equality an important factor? Nature conservation? how can we find credits that will really support and strengthen your narrative so that you can really message this climate action that you've contributed to, that you financed in a really positive way that's really going to resonate with that audience.
Now, something just when it comes to building that portfolio, that I think the slide, and we don't need to go back to it, but it showed the global capability of Cloverly. And so, different regions in the world and different technologies exist all over the globe. And for multinational companies, there could be reason to buy certain credits in certain countries just because they're located there, as an example, and aligns with their corporate mission. So it definitely is a one-stop for all with Cloverly on how they can mix and match, and they're going to get the intelligence from you to know, how to get the value out of the portfolio and ensure that, they're actually getting what they pay for as well. So I think that brings a lot of value to the clients.
Well, thanks for the endorsement, Sean, and you're hired now for as a we really appreciate it. Just wanted to end on a testimonial by Rand Ekman, who is Chief Sustainability Officer at HKS. They're a leading global architectural firm. So we worked with HKS to help them develop a offsetting strategy that enabled them to be one of the first architectural firms to calculate its scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and offset those emissions through the purchase of high quality carbon credits that not only supported their climate objectives, but really aligned with their social values as an organization. So that was really exciting to be part of. And, we look forward to working with more companies to help them on that mission.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for jumping on. I know if anybody out there listening is like me, this was a great intro, and it just leads me to want to have more discussion, or I definitely had questions that come right to mind as I'm thinking about how I can apply this with our clients. So thank you for your time. For everybody out there, as you could see by this, I'm not the carbon offset credit guru. I and Cerestel are the procurement experts to be able to align you and bring the expert in carbon offset crediting like Cloverly to the table so that you can make a better informed decision about your carbon offsetting and sustainability program. So Christy, thank you so much. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Sean. Thank you.
Great. So with that said, we're going to close out. We did go a little long today, but I don't see how we could have went shorter, quite honestly. For those of you listening, you're going to receive an email with the ability to just pick time on the calendar so you can go deeper with Cloverly and Cerestel on your sustainability needs and carbon offsetting requirements. So have a blessed day, and we will see you on the next episode of The Grind. Thank you.